this investigation further along. So what I've worked on here, like I said, is on the impact on women in the communities, and to this effect I have been studying the transformation, community transformation and territorial transformation in the Amazonian communities in one of the areas with the most diversity of the country. So we're talking about an area that doesn't have a lot of intervention in Bolivia, and this part, as you can see on the map, is one of the places where you have the greatest concentration of diversity of indigenous populations in the entire country. So here we have approximately 7 different cultures, 7 different languages, which are all concentrated here on the region that you can see, which is what I have been looking at up to now. So this research is something that I have done based on a psychosocial issue, and that's where we're going to see how the impacts of Chinese presence in the area, how they have affected directly the dynamics, the social dynamics and community dynamics, transforming them from the most basic daily issues, and how that is related as well with the lack of the government and the national government in those areas, which are also very difficult to reach. So we can talk about the main impacts which we can see in the Amazonic communities, is how the life experiences and the experience with this Chinese presence in these areas is understood and is lived by these communities, and specifically among women and children, and as an interruption, and also in almost like an encroachment, which directly impacts their bodies and their territories, which for the communities and for the indigenous people is very difficult for them to create boundaries as to where their body ends and where the territory begins. One of the main effects that we have seen, and that perhaps it's one of the most silent issues, is the masculinization of the territories. And so the first thing that you have is like a first life experience, which is that these territories are filled up with women, and how that's felt by the women in the communities. They feel like a threat. It's something that causes a lot of insecurity with them, and especially when they have really afraid about it. So in the communities, fundamentally, the community organizations that are existing now, they react with a certain level of indifference, and that's something that's very invisible among women at all levels. It's really, these fears are really minimized, and it's something that is taken as being totally natural. So this directly influences the silence of women who feel like they don't feel like they've been supported by any sort of structure beyond their own women structures, and apparently they are working, they just end up resigning themselves to these threats, which are supposedly something that they have to live with forever. So this leads to a scenario of impunity, and which is very difficult to break, and it also leaves women in a way that they are completely powerless to what is happening to them. However, if we look at the characteristics of the communities and the organizations and the networks that we have in these indigenous communities, also these indigenous people are don't have a lot of contact. There's not much presence they only interact between different indigenous communities, so there isn't a highway, so there's no way to get to these places. And so the social fabric is very important, and they provide support in the face of these kinds of deprivation which is happening, and it becomes more and more visible, and things that have become specifically present with the issue of having the Chinese companies there, and so we have the Chinese workers and the Bolivian workers that are there. This has been experiences that have been lived by the women in Bolivia, specifically in a way that is, they put together complicity and protection, and also the fact that what does it mean for them to lose their home as being a safe place. What does it mean to feel that they have lost the safe place that they have, that they used to be able to walk around in their area without any problem, and knowing that you're part of them and that it's yours and it's all, you have a direct relationship with these areas, and then to completely lose suddenly that feeling of security. So there are a lot of testimony that we've had from children as young as 6 years old, which has been one of my objectives, which would be to give them the opportunity for these people who generally are left in silence in these different dynamics. And so what I really tried to do is ask these children and women. So they say that a series of fears that they have and attacks that they've been having and problems with that they could be harmed in their body. So supposedly these issues are resolved by the transformation, which directly impacts on the restriction of their liberty, of their freedom. And so for the women who, when they are very young, they understand that, for example, starting from after 6 p.m., they can't leave the house because there's all the workers that are just around there, and it gets darker, and it's a risk for them. In addition to that, how, for example, really small details like the ones that they said and what they were telling me, because for us in our house, we don't have doors. Because their houses are, I'm going to show you some photos, their houses are just, in the way that they live in the community, it's really different. And so now they feel like they need to put on some sort of a limit between inside and outside. And they call that a door. So it's very important to resolve this from it being hidden, and so they need to resolve this by just staying inside. And what I find is that they haven't said this, but also in deleting themselves from the social scene, and that leaves them in a situation where a life where they feel like they're encaged. And so that's the way that they protect themselves from these aggressions, which leaves them. It happens the same way with them as it happens with their entire territory. So for them, it's been really important to understand and to listen to the testimonies of very small girls who say that in many different ways, and I'd like to share more with you, but I don't have enough time, that they begin to lose autonomy, and so they are children, girls and boys, who used to go out and hunt, but now it's really difficult for them to go far away from their house because of the safety conditions that they have, because of the presence of these Chinese companies. They're women, girls who don't have autonomy, security, and also a lot of self-esteem. So when we look a little bit further into this, about the relationship between women in the indigenous communities of Bolivia and the Chinese companies, we find something that's been mentioned as being a relationship that's completely governed by power. So what we see as we look further and further into this, what we find is that it's an issue of relationships that are crossed completely and dominated by issues of power. And so this is something that we can see more clearly in working conditions, and we see how the women find that it's very difficult for them to get involved in the labor activities that the company brings with it. So I'm just going to give you one example of one scenario. The girls, we have girls that are minors who are 12 years old who are going to the camps to sell water, which is very important to them there because they don't have the conditions that they need to be able to get what they need to drink very easily. And so what they do is they sell like water. And how does this in the camps, it's really interesting to think about how this through as they spend more and more time in the camps, it starts transforming every time they go through there in those same areas. It makes them feel like they're more engaged. So for example, the girls that start by selling water, then later they start offering cleaning services or washing clothes, and that movement through these different symbolic areas ends up leaving them, turns them into this idea that their work and changes their ideas about their work and their bodies. So what I would like to do is to focus right now on one of the really small fragments, which I know is pretty long, but I think it's really important to show you, which is from one of the workers of one of the Chinese companies that's building the highway, and that I think that it really reflects really clearly that the relationship, the utilitarian relationship and instrumental relationship that the workers have, the Chinese workers, with the women in the communities. So for example, here we can see that for them it's not a problem to have a relationship that they don't have, in first person because of the cultural distances and the language barriers. It's not that they're really creating a direct relationship, but what there are is that there's somebody who is fulfilling the issue of being like a mediator, an intermediary, and has to be within him. It's almost like a provider of women, like a pimp for the Chinese workers. And so these are people who then, after they have sexual relations, which it's not prostitution exactly, but they're sexual relationships with these very young girls from the communities, they then abandon them, and then they very simply they're just put on a different road section. So when they change to a different road section, the women are left alone with their children, with the children that they bore for these Chinese workers, and they never again see the father in a much weakened social fabric due to the presence, and how this entire transformation has happened due to the presence of these workers. So it's also really important to look from inside to see what are the pillars that we have that are supporting this structure. So I think that it's very important to this effect for us to also look at this idea of the people who are undeniably are benefited from this, people who obtain privilege from the presence of these workers. And I'm talking specifically about commercial activities. In these cases, when there are very few people who receive some privilege from the presence of the workers, so for example, they start selling alcohol, which is of course a very large impact on these indigenous communities. They didn't have this contact with alcohol. They did have it before, but not in the way that it is now, the exacerbated way. So how is it that these privileges of certain people end up defending the structure from the inside? And so to defend it from the inside, that means a series of breakages and transformations that facilitate the appropriation of the appropriation by these external people of these community areas, which become areas that are exclusively for people who hold power. So for example, so here I think it's also really important to understand how the role of alcohol becomes present in many ways, and with the women in a more indirect way, but that definitely it affects them in an important way. So one thing is that how the workers, the Chinese workers, the Bolivian workers that have a relationship with their families who also work for the Chinese companies live with really high levels of violence, and they end up having dynamics which lead them to in consuming a lot of alcohol and also the coca leaf, and which the mixture with the alcohol and the coca leaf has really terrible effects, and it's damaging to women. So we have, the employment issue is really just the tip of the iceberg, because what we see is that these mistreatments that happen within the workplace, which is outside of the families, are then reproduced by the men in their families. And so what we have here is we've got the father who's tired of being mistreated the way that he is, and the way that the Chinese workers mistreat them, that he goes home and he hits his wife, he drinks alcohol, and then the woman to her neighbor and the child, etc. And this becomes really complex. So I think that this is really interesting, but it's important to see how one of the most recent cases of employment mistreatment, we found that one of the Bolivian workers said something to a Chinese worker, and he threw boiling water on his finger. I mean, imagine that. Another issue that we have here to finish up, first, that for me it's been really interesting to see how the Chinese presence has meant, to a certain extent, environmental devastation, and how this has been, we've established parallels here with the violence against women. So additionally, what I'd like to say is that the Chinese presence has also led to a series of clandestine economies. So, for example, now these are attacks against animals, nature, forests, etc., and also against women, as I've already mentioned. So, for example, here in this case, one of the Chinese workers was reported because he was fined after many years of there being many different local complaints. He was found to be smuggling 300 teeth from the jaguars in one of the areas that it's best conserved because of the difficult access that it is to get. There's one of the places that's least intervened, and then a Chinese person comes and then would start smuggling this kind of illegal material. And so now he has house arrest. But what we find now is that this isn't necessarily a Chinese worker, but it's someone who arrived in the community. So the Chinese worker really has an intermediate relationship between, or at least this is the way that local communities say it, that he was the person who was like the provider of the women of the jaguar tooth, etc. And so he was the person that was the cause of this. And so it's a really complex panorama, and I think that all of this is really interesting to think about how, for example, Bolivia has a level of, it's so important in Bolivia, the Chinese presence in economic terms that we have. The planning, the government plan, which is written in 6 different three different languages, which is in Spanish, Chinese, and English, and I thought it was really important to cover a little bit all of this, what it reflects is a little bit about the Chinese point of view. So you can see here in this drawing, you can see how in Bolivia the Chinese are taken as being people, as a presence that's completely predatory. So here you can see how they're causing damages to the animals, to nature, and that it's completely relative to mistreatment of women as well. And that's just to close out here, a new social structure and a transformation of dynamics and social fabrics, indigenous social fabrics. And it's very important to recognize that this is not an issue of isolated cases, but rather patterns, new patterns, new employment patterns in the territory that have been caused by the Chinese presence. Good afternoon to everyone here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to start by putting here, putting Rose here, because sometimes I say that
escuchando nuestros debates
And when we get into these debates
nuestras exposiciones
and our presentations and what we have discussed during the last few days before today with the visitors that we have here, that maybe she could be a little bit angered. We feel a little bit impatient. I thought it was good that we would start with a presentation, with Norva's presentation about a set of consequences from the presence of Chinese capital in Bolivia. I'm going to continue with a description of other empirical cases which are going to have more to do with the mega mining, large-scale mining. I like to call it mega mining more than large-scale mining, and I'll tell you why. And also with empirical conditions that you are going to see that coincide with the set of impacts that Noelia described to us earlier. So I think that the focus that I'm going to propose, which is with the political, economical, and Marxist look that we have, but generally this question of accumulation can complement in a very interesting way the issue that Noelia had, which was about the analysis of the consequences and determining factors of the presence of Chinese capitalist activities in the Andean region and in Latin America in general. So while Noelia's focus allows us to get into more detail a set of impacts that, of course, in general are totally invisible to everyone. The political, economic, critical ideas help us to analyze dynamics on a more macro level, that while they may be totally blind about the consequences, the specific consequences in terms of gender or other dimensions, it can give us a better idea of what is happening, which is something that I think is really interesting, and which is why I'm proposing here today this issue of accumulation by dispossession. I'm going to tell you very briefly, because really what we'd have to do is to go into great detail to understand what is happening. Here we have two maps. The first one is a map of Ecuador with the mining concessions that have been registered and others that have been claimed by mostly international companies. So here we have these red circles, which are a couple of large projects that are underway, and those include a series of projects in this area of Ecuador, which is close to the border with Peru, which is called the Condor Mountain Range. And here you can see it in greater detail. And so in this Condor Mountain Range, we have a series of large mining projects that are currently underway. Ecuador, to date, has not extracted through large-scale mining not even 1 gram of metal, but it is just about to do so. And one of the projects that are most advanced is Mirador, which is in the north of the province of Zamora Chinchipe, and another project which is also which I'm going to talk about further ahead, which is Pananza San Carlos, which is in Morona, Santiago province. These two products are in the hands of two large Chinese companies, two national companies, which are Tongling Non-Ferrous Metals Group Holdings Company,
que bueno, podemos llamar Tongling,
which we
y
can
la
call it
otra
Tongling, and the
que
other
no es
one
una
is
empresa
not a
minera. Esta
mining
es una empresa
company. The
minera
first one is a
de
mining
extracción,
company, is a
pero también
mining
de
extraction
refinación,
company, but also a
y esta es
refinery.
una empresa de
And
construcción,
below is a
¿ya? Más
construction
bien
company,
ferrocarriles
which
y
does
otras obras de
railways and
ingeniería.
other
La
sorts
China
of
Railways
engineering, the
Construction
China
Corporation,
Railways Construction
de la cual
Corporation,
Enrique creo que
which
ha escuchado hablar
Enrique
en
has heard
México,
has heard the start about in
tiene
Mexico.
algunos negocios
He's
por ahí.
had some business activity there.
Entonces, los dos
So here, these
proyectos
two projects,
mineros abarcan,
mining
como es el
projects,
caso
cover,
con la miga
as you
minería,
can see with
grandes
the case of the
extensiones
mega
de
mining,
territorio, en el caso de
large
Mirador,
areas,
casi 10.000 hectáreas, en el
about
caso de Panamá San
10,000
Carlos, casi
hectares,
40.000
in
hectáreas.
Bonanza, it's
Y tienen
almost
previsto
40,000
una extracción a gran
hectares. So we
escala,
see that we
con
have
en un caso
large-scale
60.000
mining.
toneladas
One is 60,000
de diarias
tons per day
minerales tratados,
of
y en el otro caso
treated
90.000
minerals, and the other one
toneladas.
has
Hay
90,000
que
tons of
recordar
mineral
que
per day. So
el
what we have
modelo
to remember
actual
is that the
en
current
términos de
model
megaminería
in terms
es
of
un modelo de
large-scale mining
gigantismo.
is
Eso es la palabra que
gigantism,
caracteriza el
and
modelo.
that's the
Por lo
word to
tanto,
characterize this
las
whole issue.
empresas
So the
necesitan
companies, what they need
un control
is a control,
reforzado
to reinforce
total,
control and full
sobre
control
los territorios donde
about
quieren
the
emprender
areas
este
where they
negocio
want to
que necesita grandes
undertake
extensiones
this
de
project, which
territorios,
involves large areas
donde
of
se va a
land
emprender
where
la extracción,
they
la
are
misma
going
extracción, pero
to do the
también
extraction, but
territorios
also
más,
areas,
digamos,
territories
amplios,
that are
sobre los cuales
much
se tiene que
larger,
desarrollar un conjunto de
where
infraestructuras de
there has to
transportes,
be
energéticas.
infrastructure installed, transportation, etc.
Entonces, voy a seguir un poco
So,
antes de entrar
before going further into
una serie de
a
consideraciones
series
más
of
teóricas
more
con un
theoretical
conjunto de
issues,
elementos
I'm going to
empíricos.
talk about some
Y
empirical
claro, o
methods.
sea,
And here,
el despliegue de
outlay
las actividades
of
megamineras en la Corea del Cóndor,
large-scale mining
en este
activities in the
caso,
Condor Mountain Range,
en manos
in this
de las empresas
case,
transnacionales
which is
chinas,
being managed by the Chinese
ha sido
companies,
caracterizado
has been
por este
characterized
lema
by this
de
motto or slogan
del capítulo
of
sobre la acumulación originaria del capital, que
which
es
is
que la acumulación originaria
that
se desarrolla,
accumulation
digamos,
is
o se
developed,
puede escribir en
can be
letras de
described
sangre y
in
fuego.
letters of blood and fire.
Entre las consecuencias que
So
podemos
part of the
observar
consequences that we can
en
observe here
digamos, el reciente despliegue
in this
de estas
recent
empresas que
outlay
han
or
adquirido sus
recent
proyectos
activities which are
en el
starting,
2010,
which began their
tenemos por
activities in
ejemplo
2010.
cercamientos,
We have these
cercamientos de
enclosures,
territorios
which is enclosures of
anteriormente
territories that were previously
digamos, gestionados bajo propiedad
managed
privada,
as
pero también
private
propiedad,
land, but
propiedad
also
colectiva.
as collective
Porque toda la
property,
cordillera del
because the
Cóndor
entire
es
Condor
territorio
Mountain
shuar,
Range
territorio
is shore
indígena.
territory.
¿Ya?
It's indigenous territory.
Hay
And so
varios
there are
centros
a
shuar
number
en la
of
cordillera del
shore
Cóndor,
villages in the
muchos
Condor
de ellos directamente afectados
mountains.
por
Many of them are
esta actividad
directly
minera,
affected
estos
by these
proyectos
mining
mineros
activities and
y
these extraction
digamos,
activities,
la necesidad de estas
and the
empresas
need
de
that these
asegurar un
companies
control
have
sobre estos
to
territorios.
ensure that they
Entonces,
have total control over
cercamientos
these territories. We have
de
these
territorios
enclosures of
por
these
parte de la
territories
empresa
by
con el
the
emparo
companies
de
with the
las leyes
support of
desarrollados
the
por
laws
el gobierno
created by the Ecuadorian government.
Tenemos
We
ya
have
contaminación
also pollution,
bastante marcada
which is
de
very
ríos,
noteworthy in the
talas de árboles,
rivers, cutting down
contaminación del
trees,
aire,
in
a pesar de que
contamination,
hasta la fecha no se ha
even though to
iniciado
date
la fase de extracción.
no extraction has
Hemos
happened.
tenido en el
We
caso
have
de la
had
comunidad
in
de
this case
Tundaime
of Tundaime
en la parroquia del Pangui,
in the
en el
Alpanga
caso de
parish,
Puerto Mirador,
which is
la
in
erradicación de
Puerto
un
Mirador.
barrio
We've
que
had
se
they've
llamaba el barrio San
eliminated
Marcos,
an entire
donde aquí tenemos una
neighborhood, which is
imagen
the
de la
neighborhood of
destrucción de
San
la
Marcos,
iglesia
where you can see where they were
que
tearing
se
down the
dio
church.
en el 2014.
That happened in 2014.
El año siguiente
The next
se
year,
dieron unos
they continued
desalojos,
with,
desalojos forzados,
evictions,
violentos,
forced evictions that were very
amparados
violent,
por las fuerzas
based
públicas
with the
y la destrucción de
army there to
casas
help them,
en el mismo
destruction of
sitio de
homes,
Tundaime,
and also here in
con las
Tundaime,
consecuencias
with
múltiples que
the
esto
number of
puede tener.
consequences that this caused.
Siempre para que la empresa
Always, so for
pueda
the
asegurar un
company
control
to
sobre los
ensure that it
territorios,
has full
las
control
tierras
over
que
the territories
necesita
and the lands
para
that it needs in
emprender sus
order
actividades.
to undertake its activities.
En el caso más reciente
So most
de la comunidad de
recently,
Nankins,
in
comunidad
the
Shuar,
community of Nankins, which is a
de la
Shuar
Corea del
community,
Cóndor,
which is in the Condor
ubicada en
region,
la zona
located
donde se quiere
in the
desarrollar
area
este
where
proyecto
this
de
project
Pananza
was
San
to
Carlos.
be, the Esperanza San Carlos project is
Hubo
going to be
desalojos
developed.
violentos
There were very violent
amparado por la
evictions based
por
on
la
with the
fuerza
support
pública
of
y
the army.
este desencadenó
This
en un
led
conflicto
to
muy
a
profundo
very serious
con las
conflict
comunidades
with the
indígenas.
indigenous communities.
Bueno, quisieron recuperar sus territorios,
They
y a
wanted
raíz
their
de
lands
ello
back.
el gobierno
Based on this, the
declaró
government
la provincia de Morona
declared
Santiago en
that
estado
the
de
province
excepción,
of
es
Morona
decir,
Santiago to be
un
in a
estado
state of
autoritario que
emergency,
suprime un
in an
conjunto de libertades
authoritarian
democráticas
regime to
y que sea
suspend all
acompañado con
of
una
their democratic
militarización
rights with
íntegra de toda la
militarization
provincia
of
de
the
Morona
entire
Santiago,
Morona
una presencia
Santiago
militar,
province.
varios
Presence of
centenas, incluso miles de
military
militares que hasta la fecha
of the army, and that continues to date.
con todo un conjunto de
So
consecuencias
this
que
has
no
led to
puedo
a
detallar
number of
acá, pero que
consequences that I
también,
can't tell you all about today,
digamos, hacen el
but
vínculo
that
con
also
las
is
que
related
no
to
he
what
apuntado,
Nole
porque claro,
mentioned to us
militarización
earlier, because of this
de una zona
militarization
significa
of
también
an area also
masculinización.
means masculinization.
Toda la provincia
The
militarizada,
entire province is militarized, as you can see here in the photos, with war tanks.
Solo un dato entre varios que les
So
podría
just
dar,
one
pero,
issue that I want
la
to bring
inversión
up here,
mega minera,
the investment on large-scale
todo
mining,
sumada,
all put
en
together,
China, en América
China,
Latina,
in Latin America,
ha sido concentrada
has been
en gran parte
concentrated mostly
en Perú y Ecuador. Si
in
se suma
Peru
Perú y
and
Ecuador
Ecuador.
en
So if you
términos de
add up
inversión
Peru
mega
and
minera,
Ecuador in
alcanzamos los
terms
3/4 de la
of
inversión mega minera
all
china
of
en
Latin
toda América
America,
Latina.
it covers 75% of the total investment.
Entonces, la pregunta
So
que
the question that we have,
yo me
that
planteo y
I
me sigo planteando,
ask,
porque eso
that I
es solo
continue
una
asking it
propuesta,
because this is only a
y
proposal,
que creo que aporta un poco a este
which I think
análisis
helps
de la
us
nueva presencia
to
de capitales
analyze
chinos
this new
en
presence of
nuestros
Chinese
territorios,
capital in our lands,
y que puedes tal vez, digamos,
to
identificar una
perhaps
parte de los
identify
determinantes.
one of the
Entonces, el
determining
conjunto de
factors.
preguntas son
This
las
is the
siguientes.
set of
¿Por qué
questions
los
that we
capitales
have.
chinos
Why
aquí de
Chinese
repente?
capital?
¿Por qué
Why
ahora?
here suddenly
¿Y por qué? Bueno, en un
And
territorio
why
como la Cordillera del Congo.
in the Condor Mountain Range?
Entonces es ahí que llamo un poco a
So this
la
is the
economía
point
política
when
crítica.
I say call us to
Y bueno,
be critical
el concepto de acumulación por
and to
disposición,
look at
que
this
dicho de paso
accumulation
David
by
Harvey,
dispossession,
digamos, remite bastante al trabajo de
because
Rosa
this
Luxemburgo
has goes
para
very much hand in
elaborarlo.
hand with the work
Un
of Rosa
concepto que,
Luxemburg.
digamos,
This concept
propone que
that proposes
el capital
that
tiene dos
capital
grandes
has
mecanismos de
two
acumulación,
major
un mecanismo que
mechanisms of
implica la explotación del
accumulation.
trabajo,
One that has to do with the exploitation
lo
of
que
work,
Harvey, digamos, califica de reproducción ampliada,
which is called
por una parte, y por otra parte, unos
production,
mecanismos
and also
que se suelen
mechanisms
calificar de
that are
extraeconómicos,
called
que son similares a los
extraeconomical,
mecanismos que Marx describe
which
en el
are similar to what
capítulo de la
Marx
acumulación originaria, es decir,
mentions,
mecanismos que
which are
implican
mechanisms
básicamente la
that
violencia.
basically imply violence.
Y lo que Harvey nos dice es que
What
lo
they
que
say is
esta
that this
acumulación por
accumulation
disposición
through
refleja
dispossession
son
reflects
necesidades
needs
del capital o es
of
un
the
recurso
capital,
que
or is
usa
a
el capital
resource that
cuando
uses capital
encuentra
when
problemas
they find
en países
problems
donde se
in
concentra
countries
este capital.
where there is a concentration of that
Entonces,
capital.
Harvey nos habla de
So Harvey,
sobreacumulación
what they talk to us
y
is called
que corresponde básicamente
overaccumulation,
a
which
un agotamiento del
basically
proceso
has
de
to do
acumulación
with
en,
an
digamos,
excess
las
of
regiones,
accumulation in the
las
different
zonas donde,
areas
de dónde
where
vienen estos capitales.
this capital comes from.
Y para Harvey, cuando hay un problema de
when there's
sobreacumulación, de
a problem with
agotamiento del proceso de
overaccumulation
acumulación,
and
que se
there's too much
traduce por
accumulation,
pérdida de tasas de
which
ganancia,
leads to
que se traduce por
a loss
sobrecapacidad, etc.
in
Los
rates of
capitales
return, etc. The capital,
buscan
what they
formas
seek is a
de
way
seguir
to
ganando o,
continue
digamos,
earning
acumular de manera
or
rentable.
accumulating in a way that
Entonces,
is
por eso él,
profitable.
como
And
geógrafo,
so as a
propone este concepto de
geographer, what he
reajustes
said is that this
espaciotemporales, que para
spatial
estos
temporal
capitales sobreacumulados
readjustments,
consiste
and what
en
this
buscar
consists of
ya
is
sea una forma
seeking
de
out a
invertir
way to
en
invest
activos
in
cuya
assets
rentabilidad se va
whose
a alargar en el
profitability
tiempo,
is
sería el
extended over
reajuste
time, which is a
temporal,
readjustment, temporary
o sea, irse a buscar nuevos
or to
territorios,
seek out new
nuevas oportunidades
territories,
de
new
inversión
opportunities for
rentables, serán
investment,
reajustes
which could
espaciales.
be, that would be a space-related
Entonces, mi hipótesis es
readjustment.
que
So my
se puede ver
hypothesis is that you
la
can see
agresividad reciente de China
the
con,
reason that China has
digamos, la
come in
aumentación
here with
de
the
sus
increase
inversiones
in their investments
directas extranjeras a lo largo de toda la
foreign
última década
investment over the
como
last
un reflejo
decade as a
de
reflection
problemas
of the
de la dinámica del
problems
capital en China.
of the
Un
Chinese
capital que
capital
tiende a
in China,
sobreacumularse
which tends to be
en forma de liquidez, en
overaccumulated
forma de
in terms of
sobrecapacidad,
liquidity
y que tiene
overcapacity.
justamente esta
And so
tendencia.
there's this trend,
Ya hemos visto que en China
which
se
we've
ha
seen that in
procedido
China,
a
it's
ajustes
continued, it has now moved
temporales
to
con la
make certain
construcción masiva
adjustments with
digamos,
a
con la
massive
inversión masiva
construction
en
or
el
massive
sector
investment
inmobiliario
in real
con,
estate.
digamos, el financiamiento
And
del
with
Estado
financing
mediante
by
préstamos
the government
y
through
financiamiento público.
loans and public financing.
En el caso del Ecuador,
So in
como en el
Ecuador,
caso de
what we
muchos
see is
países de
also in
América
the case of
Latina
many different countries
o
in
de
Latin
países del
America
África o
or
de países de
countries
Asia
in
del sureste
Africa or
que
Asia.
están, digamos,
We see
recibiendo
that
estas
they are
inversiones
receiving these
chinas.
Chinese investments.
Estas inversiones son bastante nuevas
These
porque
are
es nueva la
pretty new
proyección de
things
China
because this projection
fuera
by
de
China
sus
outside
fronteras.
of their
De
own
alguna manera eso
borders is something relatively new, and that
creo
has to do with, I
a
believe,
un proceso que
a
históricamente
process that
incluso
historically
en
was
los
even
países capitalistas
in capitalist
se ha
countries
repetido en
has
Estados
been
Unidos,
repeated
Inglaterra,
in the
etcétera,
United
¿no?
States and England,
Y
etc.
que,
And that
digamos, estamos
we can see
presenciando ahora
what
con
we're
China
seeing now
con
with China
el tema de las reformas
with this issue of
que se dieron desde la
reforms
llegada de Deng Xiaoping
that
y la
have
transformación de
happened
la economía china en una
recently
economía capitalista.
in the
Tal
new
vez con
capitalist
características chinas, pero que sigue siendo
way that they
capitalista y
manage their
encontrando
countries, which is a
problemas,
Chinese way of doing
digamos,
things, but they do have their own way now, which has
vinculados a
problems that are very much
modelo de
related
producción.
to this production model.
Solo quiero terminar con
So
dos
I just
cosas.
want
El
to finish
primero
off
es
here
que,
with two issues.
finalmente,
One thing is that finally,
la violencia que se ejerce,
violence
el
that
engaño, el
is
hostigamiento, el
exercised,
acoso,
the
las guerras, el
abuse,
genocidio
wars,
incluso,
genocide even,
que se desarrolla en este
is,
momento aquí en este país,
developed
¿no?
even
en la
here
Correa del
now
Cóndor,
in this country, in the Condor, in
finalmente
the
es
Condor
la
Mountain
condición
Range, is
necesaria
the
para que
necessary
estos
condition
capitales
for
puedan
these
encontrar
capitals to be able to
la forma de
find
adquirir
the
activos
way
rentables
to acquire profitable
implementar un
assets and to
control total del
implement
territorio
total
y un
control
disciplinamiento de
over
las poblaciones
their
necesario
territory
que las poblaciones
and
obviamente
disciplining
resisten
of
a
the
su
different
exterminación.
peoples who are
En
living
particular,
there who don't
poblaciones
want to be
indígenas.
exterminated, and they are fighting
Por
against
una
it,
parte eso,
specifically
por otra
indigenous
parte,
people. But on the other
el
hand,
papel del Estado en el
the
caso
role
del
of the
Ecuador
government here
ha
in
sido el
Ecuador
mismo
has
papel
been
del
the
Estado
same
que
role
Marx describe
as
muy bien
which
en
Marx
su
describes
capítulo
very
sobre
well
la
in his
acumulación
chapter
originaria.
about original
Es decir,
accumulation, which is that
Estado
when
que
a
pone,
government that
digamos, gran parte de
places
su
a
aparato
long amount
institucional
of its
y jurídico al
institutional
servicio de
system
intereses
at the service
de
of
capitales, en este
capital
caso,
interests, in this case,
Entonces,
foreign
por eso
capital
concluiría,
interests. And so
muchas gracias por
that's
su atención.
all I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much.